In the opening scene, Officer Harris publicly humiliates Jessica Carter, a highly accomplished attorney and humanitarian, by handcuffing her in the bustling airport terminal. Jessica, who had earned her law degree from a prestigious university and dedicated her career to humanitarian causes, is subjected to an unjust and degrading display of prejudice. She had arrived at the airport, eager to board her flight to a life-changing humanitarian mission abroad, only to be treated with suspicion by Officer Harris. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content. As Jessica attempts to check in, Officer Harris accosts her, scrutinizing her every move and questioning her right to be in the first-class section. The officer's actions are not just an isolated case of mistaken judgment, they reveal deep-seated biases that cloud his perception of Jessica's worthiness. His decision to handcuff her in front of other passengers is a clear demonstration of his assumptions about her, assumptions based on stereotypes rather than facts. This moment of public humiliation is not just about the physical restraint but the emotional toll of being treated as if she is less than others. For Jessica, it marks the beginning of a fight to reclaim her dignity and challenge the unfair treatment she is enduring, setting the stage for the confrontation that will follow. Before the distressing incident at the airport, Jessica Carter was fully immersed in preparing for a vital humanitarian mission in Southeast Asia. For weeks, she had been working tirelessly, coordinating with various medical organizations to ensure the success of her trip. She was packing critical medical supplies, including antibiotics, surgical instruments, and hygiene kits, that were desperately needed in underserved regions. Every detail had been carefully planned, from securing transportation to organizing volunteer teams on the ground. Her husband, Robert, the CEO of Horizon Airlines, had been supportive of her mission from the start. Together, they had discussed logistics at length, everything from the medical supplies to the necessary legal documentation. Robert, understanding the importance of her work, had personally arranged for her to travel in first class, knowing she would need the comfort and rest for the long flight ahead. Despite the intensity of her schedule, Jessica found comfort in knowing she was doing meaningful work that would help people in need. As Jessica loaded the last of the supplies into her bag, she paused for a moment, reflecting on the lives she would touch during her trip. The humanitarian work was deeply personal to her, stemming from her passion for justice and her desire to make a real difference. She looked forward to the journey, though little did she know, her arrival at the airport would lead to a confrontation that would challenge everything she had worked for, forcing her to fight for her right to be treated with respect, both as an individual and as a dedicated humanitarian. As Jessica Carter approached the security checkpoint at the airport, she couldn't have anticipated the challenge that awaited her. Officer Harris, who was stationed at the security desk, looked over her first-class ticket with clear skepticism. He raised an eyebrow, questioning whether she truly belonged in the premium section, as if somehow doubting her right to travel there. "Excuse me, miss," he began, his voice laced with condescension. "Are you sure you're in the right line? First class is for people who can afford it, you know." Jessica, taken aback but determined to remain calm, nodded and politely explained that she had the proper ticket, which had been arranged by her husband, Robert, the CEO of Horizon Airlines. But instead of accepting her explanation, Officer Harris continued to scrutinize her, his eyes scanning her clothing and demeanor. His body language radiated doubt, suggesting he believed someone like Jessica had no business occupying a seat in such a prestigious space. Despite the obvious discomfort in the air, Jessica tried to remain composed, offering to show him the documentation for her humanitarian work, hoping it might ease the tension. But Officer Harris's behavior only grew more pointed, as if he was looking for an excuse to challenge her further. Jessica could feel the weight of the officer's assumptions bearing down on her, an unfair, discriminatory judgment based solely on his own bias. His treatment of her felt personal, like a direct assault on her credibility and dignity. Despite Jessica Carter's attempts to de-escalate the situation, Officer Harris continued to treat her with blatant disrespect. As she handed over the medical documentation confirming her humanitarian mission, she felt a sense of disbelief that her credentials and hard work were being questioned so intensely. She had provided everything to prove she was more than deserving of her first-class seat, her ticket, her itinerary, and a letter from the non-profit organization she had been working with for months. Yet none of this seemed to matter to Officer Harris. "Your papers don't mean anything to me," Officer Harris snapped, glancing at the documents with disdain before shoving them aside. His dismissive attitude was clear: he was not interested in the facts, and his prejudice was clouding his judgment. "You're still not supposed to be here." Jessica's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from frustration. She had spent her career fighting for justice, and now, as a successful attorney and humanitarian, she was being treated as though she was somehow less worthy. Her stomach turned as she realized that no amount of evidence or reason would change Officer Harris's mind. This wasn't about the paperwork or the mission, it was about something deeper. His assumptions about her, based on her appearance and maybe her background, had already been made, and no amount of explanation would sway him. "I've already explained to you," Jessica said calmly, her voice steady despite the surge of anger rising within her. "I'm traveling to help people in need. This ticket was arranged through my husband, Robert Carter. You can verify it with the airline if you need to." But Officer Harris barely seemed to register her words. His eyes stayed cold, unwavering, as he continued to treat her as though she were guilty of something. His behavior escalated as he insisted that she step aside and wait for further instruction. The humiliation was palpable as other passengers began to notice the scene unfolding before them. Jessica's cheeks flushed with embarrassment, but she refused to let it show. She had spent years working to earn her place in the world, and she wasn't about to let an officer's misplaced prejudice diminish the value of her accomplishments. However, as she was moved to a secondary holding area, the reality of the situation settled in. It was becoming clear that she wasn't just being detained for questioning, this was something more. She was being treated as a criminal, unfairly, simply because Officer Harris had decided she didn't belong in that space. "Just sit down and wait," Officer Harris ordered, almost casually, as if he were dismissing her with a flick of his wrist. He didn't care about the impact of his actions, he didn't care about the truth. Jessica could see it in his eyes. He had made up his mind about her from the moment she stepped into his line of sight. As she sat there, handcuffed in the holding area, a sense of isolation began to settle over her. There she was, an attorney, a humanitarian, someone who had dedicated her life to helping others. And yet she was being treated like a criminal for no other reason than the assumptions of a biased officer. The humiliation stung, but what hurt more was the realization that this wasn't an isolated incident. This was something that countless others had experienced, something deeply ingrained in the system, an invisible barrier that only those who were targeted could see and feel. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as Jessica sat there, her mind racing. She thought of the people she was supposed to help, the children waiting for the medical supplies she had packed. She thought of her husband, Robert, and how he would react when he found out what was happening. He had always been supportive of her work, but she knew that this situation would likely be just the beginning of a much larger battle. But even in that moment, despite the physical restraint, Jessica refused to allow herself to feel powerless. She had faced adversity before, and she would face it again. This wasn't just about a wrong that had been done to her, it was about something much bigger. It was about confronting the deeply rooted prejudices that still existed in society, the biases that led to unjust treatment and unequal opportunities for countless individuals. Her anger was not just for herself but for the others who had been through similar situations and hadn't had the means or the voice to challenge it. This moment was a turning point, a moment when Jessica made a silent vow to herself: this wasn't the end. She would fight back, not just for her own dignity but for the dignity of anyone who had ever been treated unjustly because of their race, gender, or background. As she waited in that holding area, Jessica knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. The fight had just begun, and she was determined to see it through to the end. As Jessica Carter sat handcuffed in the holding area, her mind raced, yet she remained as composed as she could manage. Officer Harris had already humiliated her in front of countless passengers, questioning her right to be in the first-class section. Despite providing ample documentation for her humanitarian work, he continued to treat her with disdain, as though she was undeserving of the respect any traveler should expect. But now, in the holding area, Jessica knew that the situation wasn't just about the momentary insult, it was about standing her ground in the face of injustice. She wasn't just sitting there as a victim. She was ready to take action, to assert her rights, and to make sure that this was not something she would allow to pass quietly. The silence of the room around her felt heavy, but in her mind, the wheels were already turning. Jessica's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her focus on the officer standing nearby. She quickly checked the screen and saw that it was a message from her husband, Robert. He had been trying to reach her all morning, and his message was brief: "Are you all set? Everything's ready for you to board. Let me know when you land." Her heart dropped. She had hoped to be on her way to Sudan, not trapped in a holding area, humiliated and detained for no reason other than the prejudices of an officer. She quickly typed a response: "I'll call you soon. Everything's fine." But in her heart, she knew it wasn't fine. The situation had spiraled out of control in a way that she hadn't anticipated. How could this happen to her, someone who had dedicated her career to justice, to helping people in need? But that was the reality. Despite the fact that she was an attorney, a humanitarian, and an educated woman, she was being treated as less than, as if her worth and her rights were somehow negotiable. As the seconds ticked by, Jessica felt her patience begin to wear thin. Officer Harris was still standing at the far end of the room, occasionally glancing her way. He had already proven that he wasn't interested in hearing her side, that he was content to keep her handcuffed in a room, publicly embarrassed, without giving her any valid reason for the treatment. The silence between them grew, but Jessica refused to make the first move. Instead, she held her ground, her shoulders squared and her back straight. She was not going to allow herself to become intimidated or frightened. Minutes passed, and Jessica's resolve only hardened. She had spent her life fighting for fairness, equality, and justice, and she wasn't about to let Officer Harris's biased actions define her today. She needed to stay calm, to show that despite the stress and the humiliation, she was in control of herself. If she showed any sign of weakness, the officer would think he had the power to break her, but she wasn't going to let that happen. She looked around at the other passengers who had seen the scene unfold. Some had already returned to their own business, walking past her as though nothing was wrong. Others were still watching from the edges of the room, their curiosity clear, but no one had stepped forward to speak out on her behalf. Jessica wasn't expecting them to. She had learned a long time ago that, in situations like this, people often remain silent out of fear or indifference. The lack of intervention only made her more resolute to stand up for herself. It was then that she decided to take action. She had to assert her rights. Her composure was her strength, but she also knew she couldn't let this moment pass without making a stand. She needed to speak up, to take control of the narrative that Officer Harris was so eager to dictate. "I request to make a phone call," she said, her voice firm but not loud. The words were simple, but they carried weight. She knew her rights, and she knew that the officer could not deny her the ability to contact her husband or legal counsel. Her voice didn't tremble, and she kept her eyes locked on the officer as she spoke. She wasn't asking, she was asserting her right to communication. For a moment, Officer Harris didn't respond. He stood still, likely surprised by her calm defiance. Finally, he spoke, his tone more begrudging than before. "Fine," he muttered, as though granting her permission reluctantly. "Make your call, but don't think this changes anything." Jessica nodded and pulled out her phone, dialing Robert's number quickly. As the phone rang, her heart pounded, but she kept her composure. She had no idea how Robert would respond, but she knew he would be as furious as she was about what had just happened. And once he knew what was going on, things were bound to change. When Robert picked up, his voice immediately turned concerned. "Jessica? What's going on? I've been trying to reach you." "Robert, it's a long story, but I've been detained by airport security. Officer Harris won't let me go. He's treating me like I'm a criminal," Jessica said, keeping her voice steady. She briefly explained the situation, from the questioning of her first-class ticket to the handcuffs and the holding area. Robert's response was immediate, filled with determination. "Stay where you are, Jessica. I'm on my way. I'm calling the airline and making sure this gets sorted out. You'll be out of there in no time." Hearing his reassuring words gave her a renewed sense of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. With Robert's influence and support, things were about to change. But even more, Jessica knew that this wasn't just about her, it was about fighting the injustice and biases that were so deeply embedded in society. The fight was just beginning, but Jessica was ready to face it head-on. The tension in the holding area was palpable as Jessica Carter sat silently, handcuffed, waiting for the next move in a situation she never could have anticipated. Officer Harris, who had instigated this entire ordeal, seemed to stand guard at the far side of the room, his presence both oppressive and indifferent. Jessica's mind was focused, sharp, analytical, determined. She was no longer just waiting to be released, she was already preparing herself for what was to come next. It wasn't long before Jessica heard the unmistakable sound of hurried footsteps approaching from the distance. Her breath caught in her chest for a moment, but she didn't allow herself to react. She knew this was the moment things would change. Her husband, Robert, was on his way. As the CEO of Horizon Airlines, he had the resources, the influence, and the determination to set things right. But it wasn't just his position that made him powerful, it was the strength of his character, his unwavering support for her, and his ability to act when the moment demanded it. When Robert entered the terminal, he was not alone. Flanked by several key executives from Horizon Airlines, his presence in the room immediately shifted the power dynamics. Jessica could see Officer Harris's posture change subtly, his once confident stance faltered as he became aware of the company leadership now in front of him. The air in the room seemed to thicken, and Jessica could see the realization dawn in the officer's eyes. He was no longer dealing with just any passenger, he was facing the consequence of his actions in a very real and unavoidable way. Robert wasted no time. His eyes briefly scanned Jessica's restrained form, a silent acknowledgement of the unfairness she had suffered, before turning his full attention to Officer Harris. His voice, calm but authoritative, carried across the room with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. "Officer Harris," he began, his tone firm but not shouting, "I'm here to address this situation. My wife, Jessica, has been unfairly detained and treated with extreme disrespect, despite providing all the necessary documentation for her travel. This is completely unacceptable." Jessica could see the shift in Officer Harris's demeanor as the words left Robert's mouth. What had started as a confrontation now felt like a carefully orchestrated reminder to the officer that his actions had consequences far beyond just an isolated exchange. Robert's stature and position within the airline were not lost on Officer Harris, who seemed to squirm under the growing pressure. The presence of the airline executives further amplified the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just an issue that could be swept under the rug. "What exactly is the problem here, Officer Harris?" Robert continued, his gaze unwavering. "My wife has every right to travel as she sees fit, and she is more than qualified to sit in first class. There is no justification for this behavior. You've embarrassed her, you've humiliated her, and now you will answer for it." The room was silent for a beat. Officer Harris stood motionless, likely weighing the weight of Robert's words. The realization that he had made a massive mistake seemed to settle on him slowly. What began as a simple act of prejudice, questioning Jessica's right to a first-class seat based on assumptions about her, had now escalated into a situation that would have far-reaching repercussions for him. The severity of the misstep was becoming painfully clear to him. Jessica's eyes met Robert's for a brief moment. He was calm, composed, but there was a firmness in his gaze that told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't going to let this go. And as much as she was relieved to have him by her side, she also felt a growing sense of empowerment. Her voice, once quiet in the face of officer-induced intimidation, would now be amplified through Robert's actions and the support of the airline's leadership. "Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" Robert asked, his tone unyielding. "This is not just about my wife being treated poorly, it's about a systemic issue that needs to be addressed. Your actions, Officer Harris, have consequences not only for you but for the way others are treated in the future. We'll be reviewing the conduct of the airport security personnel and discussing this with the appropriate authorities. You will be held accountable." As the tension in the room mounted, Officer Harris seemed to shrink in stature, the weight of his earlier actions slowly catching up with him. He mumbled something unintelligible, but his words were of little consequence now. It was clear that his authority had been stripped away, replaced by the undeniable force of Robert's presence and the power of the airline's executives. Jessica's mind began to clear, and for the first time since the incident began, she could breathe more easily. The support she had received from Robert and the airline leadership had made a difference. She had always known that her husband's influence could move mountains, but today, that influence had shifted the course of her unjust detention. As the officers began to reassess the situation, Jessica allowed herself a small moment of relief. Officer Harris had been confronted with the reality of his actions, and Jessica knew that things would change, both for her and for those who would be affected by this systemic bias in the future. She wasn't just a victim in this situation. She was a catalyst for change. And with Robert's unwavering support, she was ready to keep fighting, not only for her own dignity but for anyone else who faced the kind of unfair treatment she had just endured. The mistake had been made, but now it was time to ensure that those responsible were held accountable, and that the changes Jessica advocated for would make a difference for others in the future. The moment Robert Carter and the airline executives entered the terminal, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Officer Harris, once so certain of his authority, now found himself on the defensive, his posture slightly slumped as the weight of his actions began to sink in. Robert, tall and confident, didn't waste a moment. He immediately addressed the officer, his voice steady and authoritative, signaling to the others in the room that this was no longer just an isolated incident, it was a matter of accountability. "Officer Harris," Robert began, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You've detained my wife, Jessica, for no reason other than your own prejudiced assumptions. She is not just a passenger, she is a humanitarian, an attorney, and someone who has earned her right to be in that first-class seat. Your actions here today are not only unjust, they're completely unacceptable." Jessica, still seated in the holding area with her wrists handcuffed, felt a surge of relief as she heard Robert's words. She knew he would fight for her, but hearing him speak with such resolve gave her strength. She hadn't been able to defend herself fully in the moment, but now, with Robert at her side, the tide was beginning to turn. Officer Harris stood still, his eyes darting nervously between the executives and Robert. It was clear to Jessica that he had not anticipated such an immediate response. His confidence had shattered the moment the airline's leadership entered the room. This wasn't just about a routine check or minor misunderstanding anymore, it was a serious issue that would have serious consequences for him. "Robert, Officer Harris stammered, his voice faltering under the pressure. But Robert wasn't willing to let him off the hook so easily. "No, Officer Harris. You don't get to explain this away," Robert interrupted, his voice unwavering. "You've publicly humiliated my wife, questioned her credentials, and refused to acknowledge the documents she provided to prove she is not only authorized to travel in first class, but is also on a critical humanitarian mission. That's the definition of unjust treatment, and it needs to be addressed immediately." The officer's face reddened, and for a moment, Jessica could see a flash of discomfort in his eyes. He had been confronted, not just by her husband, but by the reality that his actions had far-reaching consequences. The presence of the airline executives, who had come to support Jessica and Robert, was further evidence that the situation was far from ordinary. This wasn't just a random encounter, it was a powerful reminder of the systemic issues that allowed bias and discrimination to go unchecked. Jessica's mind raced as she listened to Robert take charge. She had never felt so supported, so heard, and yet, she couldn't shake the anger that simmered beneath the surface. She had spent years earning her position in the world, fighting against injustice and inequality, only to find herself in this position, handcuffed, humiliated, and unfairly treated by someone who should have been upholding the law. Robert continued, his tone growing firmer as he addressed Officer Harris. "You've violated not only my wife's rights but also the integrity of the institution you represent. The repercussions of this incident will not be taken lightly. I'm going to ensure that this issue is raised with the airline's leadership, with airport authorities, and with any other organization that will listen. This is bigger than just this moment. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The silence in the room was deafening. Officer Harris didn't speak, he could barely meet Robert's eyes. His previous bravado was gone, replaced by a recognition of his mistake, and the heavy consequences that would follow. "Your actions," Robert continued, "will be fully investigated, and I will personally see to it that appropriate steps are taken. The public humiliation, the way you treated Jessica, this isn't just an isolated incident. It's a reflection of a larger issue, and it needs to be addressed with the seriousness it deserves." The airline executives nodded in agreement, their faces grim. Jessica, who had been quietly observing the scene unfold, now felt a sense of pride. This wasn't just about her, this was about standing up for fairness, equality, and dignity. Officer Harris had made a mistake, one that would have consequences not just for him but for the system that allowed his actions to go unchecked. As Robert finished speaking, Officer Harris mumbled an apology, but it was too little, too late. The words felt hollow and insincere, a mere attempt to save face in the face of undeniable accountability. Jessica, still handcuffed, stared at him without saying a word. She didn't need his apology. What she needed, what they both needed, was a change. This had to be a turning point, not just for their lives, but for anyone who had ever been subjected to the kind of treatment she had faced. With the support of Robert, the airline executives, and her own unyielding resolve, Jessica knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Officer Harris would face the repercussions of his actions, and the system would begin to change, because she wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. The fallout from the incident led to swift and significant changes in the airport's security policies. Jessica Carter's ordeal had sparked a much-needed conversation about discrimination, systemic bias, and accountability, and it was clear that the airport could no longer ignore the issue. Thanks to the determination of Robert, the airline executives, and their unwavering commitment to justice, the reforms began to take shape quickly. The first major change was the implementation of mandatory anti-bias training for all security personnel. The training focused on raising awareness about unconscious prejudices and the importance of treating every passenger with dignity and respect. It was designed not just as a formality, but as a genuine effort to address the underlying issues that had led to Jessica's mistreatment. Additionally, the airport adopted a policy requiring the use of body cameras by security officers. This was a crucial step in ensuring accountability and transparency. The cameras would act as an unbiased witness, providing clear evidence in case of disputes and protecting both passengers and officers from unjust accusations. Jessica, with Robert's full support, became a vocal advocate for these reforms, pushing for their immediate implementation. "Everyone deserves to be treated with first-class respect," she said during a public statement, reflecting on the ordeal. "This isn't just about me. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I went through." The changes at the airport were not just cosmetic, they reflected a deeper commitment to addressing discrimination in all its forms. Jessica's experience had catalyzed a systemic shift, setting a new standard for how passengers, particularly those from marginalized groups, should be treated in every part of the travel experience.